It started with a fake $20 bill. A man walked into a Minneapolis corner store, bought cigarettes, and paid with a 20 the teenager behind the counter thought looked wrong. So the teenager made a call. What that one call set in motion would be filmed, fought over in a courtroom the whole world watched, and argued about long after the verdict came down. It all began with $20 and a pack of cigarettes. Subscribe before we begin. It is free, and it keeps stories like this alive. Chapter 1. The Man on the Corner. Before we get to the corner, and the officers, and the 9 minutes the whole world would eventually watch, we have to start with the man. Because this is the story of 9 minutes and 29 seconds on a Minneapolis street corner, and it is also the story of how one teenager's phone forced a nation to look at something it had spent a very long time deciding not to see. It is a story stitched together from details that should not sit beside each other. A senior officer with nearly 19 years on the force, and a complaint file almost no one had ever read. 2 other officers who had been police for a matter of days. 2 autopsies that landed on the very same one-word verdict and were then used to argue opposite things. A city that would agree to pay $27 million before a trial had even begun. We will get to all of it, but none of it means anything until you know who was lost. His name was George Perry Floyd Jr., and he was 46 years old. He was born on the 14th of October, 1973, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. When he was still very young, his parents separated, and his mother, Larcenia Floyd, who everyone called Sissy, moved her children to Houston, Texas. They settled in the 3rd Ward, in a public housing complex called the CUNY Homes, in a part of the city where the distance between a hard life and a harder one was measured in very small margins. He grew up there. He was, by every account that survives him, a gentle giant of a kid, the kind other children gathered around rather than ran from. He was also enormous. By his teens he stood well over 6 feet tall, and he could move, and in a city that takes its high school sports seriously, that was a kind of currency. At Jack Yates High School, he played tight end on the football team and was a co-captain in basketball. In 1992, his team reached the Texas State Football Championship, the biggest stage a kid from the CUNY Homes could have imagined. He graduated the following year. Sports were supposed to be the way out, and for a while they were the door. He won athletic scholarships, first to a community college in Florida, and then to Texas A&M University at Kingsville. But the classroom was harder ground than the court, and the degree never came. He returned to Houston without it, back to the same ward, into a city that did not have an obvious second plan for a young man whose first plan had just closed. He found music. In the Houston rap scene of the late 90s, he performed under the name Big Floyd, and he ran for a time with the Screwed Up Clique, the loose collective built around the legendary DJ Screw. His verses were slow and deep and unhurried, the voice of a very large man who did not need to raise it. It was a community and a kind of belonging, and for a while it was enough. And then came the years that the later coverage would either dwell on or look away from, depending on what the writer wanted him to be. Between 1997 and 2005, he was arrested and jailed a number of times, on charges involving drugs and theft and trespass, and a later case, an armed robbery he pleaded guilty to in 2007, cost him the most, several years in a Texas prison. These are facts, and a fair telling does not hide them. But they are also not the whole man, and the trap of a story like this is to let the worst chapter of a life stand in for the life. He was someone who struggled, badly, with addiction, in a country that has spent decades deciding that addiction is a crime rather than an illness. Millions of people carry that same struggle. Almost none of them become the reason a nation marches. What is true, and what matters, is what he did next. In his early 40s, he made a decision that addiction makes very hard, and that he made anyway. He decided to start over, and he decided he could not do it in Houston. Through a Christian ministry he had become involved with, he joined a program that placed men in Minneapolis to rebuild their lives. He moved north, into a colder and whiter city more than 1,000 miles from everything he knew, because the version of himself he wanted to be could not be reached from where he was standing. In Minneapolis he worked. He did a stint with the Salvation Army. He drove for a time. He took security jobs, the kind that put a very large and very calm man at a door at night, and he was good at them. He worked the floor at a restaurant called the Conga Latin Bistro, and he worked security at a club called El Nuevo Rodeo, a detail that will matter later for reasons no one could have guessed. He had children. His youngest daughter Gianna was a little girl who adored him, and whose face will return at the very end of this story in a way that is almost unbearable. He was not a saint, and the people who loved him do not need him to have been one. He was a man in his middle 40s who had decided, late and against the odds, to become the better version of himself, and who was, in the spring of 2020, in the middle of trying. That spring was cruel to him before the corner ever was. The pandemic arrived, and the club work dried up, because clubs closed. He caught the coronavirus and recovered from it. At one point he was hospitalized after an overdose. He was, in other words, a man under enormous pressure, doing his unglamorous best to hold a new life together while the world contracted around him. On the evening of the 25th of May, he drove to a corner store for something small. He had no idea that he was driving toward the end of his life, or that the men who would end it were, some of them, already very close by. Chapter 2. The Men in Uniform. There were 4 of them, and the easiest mistake this story invites is to flatten them into a single shape. They were not one thing. They had different ages, different histories, and wildly different amounts of time in uniform, and those differences would matter enormously when the law finally sorted them. The senior man was Derek Michael Chauvin. He had been a Minneapolis police officer for close to 19 years. He was, in the language of the department, a field training officer, which means the department trusted him to teach new recruits how the job was actually done on the street. He carried a complaint history that, depending on which accounting you read, ran to roughly 18 entries over his career. What is not disputed is how few of those complaints ever produced any consequence. The great majority were closed with no discipline at all. 2 ended in nothing more than letters of reprimand. A man can generate that kind of record and remain in good standing for nearly 2 decades, and the fact that he can is part of what this story is about. Chauvin also worked, as many officers do, a second job. For close to 17 years he had done off-duty security work, and one of the places he worked was a nightclub on the edge of the city called El Nuevo Rodeo. If that name sounds familiar, it should. It is the same club where George Floyd had worked security. This is the detail that the internet seized on, and it is the detail that has to be handled with the most care, because it is genuinely uncertain. The 2 men were in the same building on some of the same nights. Whether they ever actually knew each other, whether they ever exchanged more than a nod, is something no one has been able to establish. The former owner of the club, asked directly, said she would not describe them as knowing one another, only that their paths would have crossed. So we will not say they knew each other. We will only say that the city was, in the end, much smaller than it looked. Then there were the 2 rookies, and the word rookie is not a flourish here, it is the centre of the matter. Thomas Lane had come to policing late, joining the department as a cadet in his mid-30s. He had become a full officer only the previous December. On the night in question he was, for all practical purposes, days into doing the job on his own. He had no prior complaints against him at all. Alongside him was J. Alexander Kung, a young man who had graduated from the University of Minnesota and joined the force not long before. Kung was so new that his field training officer, the veteran assigned to show him the ropes, was Derek Chauvin himself. Hold that thought, because it explains a great deal about why a very junior officer did not stop a very senior one. The 4th was Tu Thao, who fell in between. He had around 11 years on the force, fewer than Chauvin and far more than the rookies. He carried his own handful of complaints, including a prior lawsuit alleging excessive force that the city had quietly settled years before. On this night his role would be to face outward, to keep the gathering crowd of bystanders back from the other 3. That is the cast, a 19-year veteran with a buried record, 2 recruits barely off their training wheels, one of them being trained by the veteran, and a mid-career officer with a settlement already behind him. 4 men who would arrive at the same corner within minutes of each other on a quiet holiday evening, and the rank among them flowed exactly the wrong way that night. The officers with the least standing to object were the ones close enough to see how badly Floyd was struggling, while the man with the authority to end it was the one bearing down with his weight. And the thing that brought them there was almost nothing at all. Inside Cup Foods, A 19-year-old cashier had sold George Floyd a pack of cigarettes and taken a $20 bill in payment. The cashier thought the bill looked counterfeit. A clerk who took a bad bill could have it docked from his own pay, so, reluctantly, he reported it. A short time later, someone in the store dialed the police, though by the owner's own account that was not quite what the store's rules called for. The cashier would say later that he felt sick about it, that he had no idea what he was setting in motion. He could not have known. No one calls the police about a $20 bill, expecting it to end a man's life. But the call was placed just after 8 o'clock, and somewhere out in the warm evening, 4 officers began to move toward a grocery store on the corner of 38th and Chicago. What happened in the next 20 minutes was filmed from half a dozen angles, and what those angles showed would not match, in any particular, the story the police would tell the world that night. What the police told the world that night was about to collide with one teenager's video. Subscribe and stay with it. Chapter 3. The Stop. The record of what happened next is not a matter of memory or rumour. It exists on body camera footage, on store surveillance video, and on a teenager's phone, all stamped with the time, and it has been laid out minute by minute in the criminal charges. So we can walk it the way the investigators did, carefully, in order. Just after 8 o'clock came the call about the bill. A few minutes later, the first 2 officers arrived. They were the rookies, Lane and Kung. They found George Floyd sitting in a vehicle parked near the corner with 2 other people. What happened in those first moments set the temperature for everything after. Lane approached the driver's window and almost at once drew his handgun and pointed it at Floyd, before holstering it again. Floyd, by every account, was frightened. He was a large man being ordered out of a car at gunpoint over a phone call he may not have fully understood, and he began immediately to plead. They got him out of the vehicle and handcuffed him. For a few minutes there was a kind of awful, ordinary back and forth. The officers trying to walk him across the street to their squad car, Floyd growing more and more distressed, telling them he was claustrophobic, that he could not breathe, that he did not want to be put in the back of the car. He was not fighting them so much as failing to comply, the resistance of panic rather than aggression. This is a distinction the law would later spend weeks examining. Slow down here, because everything that mattered was already in motion, and none of it was yet irreversible. A man in handcuffs, frightened of an enclosed space, telling 4 armed officers that he could not breathe, is a problem with a dozen ordinary solutions. He could have been sat on the curb. He could have been given a moment to calm down. He could have been driven the short distance to a hospital, which is in fact where a distressed man belonged. None of those things required courage or improvisation. They were routine. The tragedy of the next several minutes is not that the officers faced an impossible situation and chose wrong. It is that they faced a manageable one and chose the single option that could not be undone. Around this time, the second pair arrived. Chauvin and Tao pulled up, and Chauvin, as the senior officer present, took command of the scene. From the moment he stepped out, the decisions were his, and the 2 rookies, one of them being trained by Chauvin that very season, deferred to the man with 19 years and the authority that came with them. They tried to fold Floyd into the back seat of the squad car. He could not do it. He told them, over and over, that he could not breathe in there, that being closed inside the car terrified him. And it was here that the encounter tipped from an arrest into something else. Rather than wait, rather than try another way, the officers made a decision. At a little before 20 minutes past 8, they pulled George Floyd out of the squad car and brought him down onto the pavement, face down, in the street, beside the rear wheel, still handcuffed behind his back. And then they held him there. Kung put his weight on Floyd's back, Lane took his legs, and Derek Chauvin put his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck and the side of his head, and he settled his weight down, and he did not get up. Consider how small the supposed crime still was at this moment. No one had been hurt, no weapon had been found. The entire matter, the thing that had summoned 4 officers to this corner, was a single $20 bill that a teenager thought looked fake. A man was now pinned to the ground in the street under the weight of 3 grown officers over a counterfeit note for cigarettes. By any measure of proportion, the emergency was over. He was handcuffed. He was surrounded. He was going nowhere. What came next did not need to come at all. That is the hardest fact in this entire story, and it is the one the law would eventually agree on. There was no necessity left. There was only a choice, and the choice was to keep kneeling. On the body camera audio, one of the officers can be heard explaining, almost to himself, that they had to control this man because he was a big guy and looked like he might be on something. It is a small line, easy to miss in the noise of the moment, but it would echo through everything that came after. The idea was already being spoken into the record before George Floyd had even stopped breathing, that here was a large man on drugs, dangerous by his size and his chemistry rather than by anything he was actually doing. Hold on to that sentence. Many months later, in a courtroom, that exact idea would be dressed up by expert witnesses and presented as the whole defense. A small crowd was beginning to form on the sidewalk, an ordinary evening's worth of people, walking to the store, heading home, drawn by the sight of a man on the ground. Some of them took out their phones. One of them was about to record the most consequential 9 minutes of video in modern American history. Chapter 4. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. This is the chapter the rest of the story orbits, and it has to be told with care, because the temptation is to reach for the language of horror, and the truth does not need it. The horror is in the duration, and in the ordinariness of the street around it, and in the fact that so many people watched and could do nothing. It does not require a single graphic word. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Derek Chauvin knelt on George Floyd. In the first stretch of that time, Floyd spoke. He told the officers, again and again, that he could not breathe. By one careful count entered at trial, he said it more than 24 times. He said he was in pain. He said please. He called out for his mother, who had in fact died 2 years before, the way a person calls out at the very edge of themselves. At one point he said that he was about to die. The officer kneeling on him answered that it took a great deal of oxygen to talk. The bystanders saw it too, and they begged. A man on the sidewalk who had once been trained in these things called out that Floyd was not resisting, that they were killing him. An off-duty firefighter happened to be passing, a trained medic, and she identified herself and asked, and then pleaded, to be allowed to check his pulse or to render aid. She was kept back. Another man stood weeping openly, and a 17-year-old girl, walking to the store with a younger cousin, took out her phone and began to film, and she did not stop. And that decision is very likely the only reason you have ever heard George Floyd's name. Twice during those minutes, the rookie officer Lane asked aloud whether they should roll Floyd onto his side, the recovery position, the thing you are trained to do for someone in distress. Twice he was overruled. The answer he got was that this was why they were keeping him on his stomach. There is something almost unwatchable about the geometry of those minutes, and it has nothing to do with gore. It is the gap between how many people were present and how little any of them could do. A trained medic stood feet away, asking to help, and was refused. A junior officer twice suggested the correct intervention and was overruled by his own training officer. A crowd of ordinary people stood on a sidewalk in the early evening, narrating their own helplessness in real time, telling the officers exactly what was happening and exactly what was going to happen, and being right. Everyone who needed to know what was wrong knew it. The information was not missing, only the decision to act on it was. At a little after 24 minutes past 8, George Floyd stopped moving. Shortly after that, he stopped speaking, and then he appeared to stop breathing. One of the officers checked for a pulse and could not find one, and said so out loud, and still the knee did not lift. Chauvin remained on Floyd's neck after he had gone silent, after he had gone still, after a fellow officer announced there was no pulse. An ambulance was called, upgraded, and when the paramedics arrived they found a man already unresponsive and had to lift him onto a stretcher, with the officer only then rising off of him. The knee came up at around 27.5 minutes past 8. By then, by any meaningful measure, George Floyd was already gone. He was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital at 25 minutes past 9 that evening. Now, the number. For months, the figure that the world would write on cardboard signs and chant in the streets was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It came from the first criminal complaint, and it became a kind of liturgy, a unit of time that everyone suddenly understood. But that figure was wrong, and strangely, it was wrong in both directions. The complaint's own timeline, added up correctly, came to 7 minutes and 46 seconds, and a correction to that effect was issued. Yet when the full body camera footage was later reviewed and the timeline rebuilt frame by frame, the true span turned out to be longer than either number. It was 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Both the prosecution and the defence would come to use that corrected number at trial. The world had been chanting a figure that, if anything, undersold how long it had lasted. Think about what 9 minutes and 29 seconds actually is. It is longer than most songs. It is long enough to drive across a town. It is long enough to change your mind a dozen times. It is an eternity to hold a position you have been told, out loud, by the man dying beneath you and by the people screaming on the sidewalk, is killing him. It was not a flash of panic. It was a decision, sustained, second after second after second, while the whole corner begged. When it was over, the police went back to their precinct, and that night the department put out a statement about what had happened. It is one of the most important documents in this entire story, not because of what it said, but because of how completely it would fail to survive contact with the truth. What the department said had happened, and what the city was about to see for itself, were two different things. Subscribe and keep watching. Chapter 5. The Story That Did Not Survive the Night. The headline the Minneapolis Police Department put out on the night of the 25th of May read, in effect, that a man had died after a medical incident during a police interaction. Read it again, because the craft of it is the point. A man had died. There had been a medical incident. It had happened during an interaction with police. Every individual word was, in the narrowest sense, defensible. A man had died, that was true. There had been a medical emergency, in the sense that a human heart had stopped. Police had been present. And yet the sentence as a whole was an act of concealment so smooth that, in almost any other year of American history, it would have worked. The statement said that officers had responded to a report of a forgery. It said the man appeared to be under the influence and in medical distress, and that officers had called an ambulance. It did not mention that he had been pinned face down in the street for more than 9 minutes. It did not mention a knee on a neck. It did not mention that he had said more than 24 times that he could not breathe, or that bystanders had begged for his life, or that an officer had kept kneeling after there was no pulse. It described a death that simply happened, near police, the way weather happens. Tragic, unowned, closed. This is how these stories had usually ended. A man dies in custody. The department issues a statement of careful, lawyerly fog. There is no video, or the video is the department's own, and a public with no reason to look closer moves on. The paragraph becomes the official memory, and the official memory becomes the only memory. For a very long time in this country, that was the entire mechanism, and it ran quietly and well. It ran well because it relied on a single, quiet assumption, which was that when an official account and a private citizen's account disagreed, the official account would be believed. That assumption had survived a great deal. It had survived earlier deaths in other cities, earlier recordings that were grainy or partial or began too late. It was not a written rule. It was simply the default setting of the whole arrangement, the thing that did not have to be argued because everyone already behaved as though it were true. And the assumption was not even unreasonable on its face. Memory is unreliable, frightened witnesses contradict one another, and a grieving crowd is easy to wave away as exaggerating. A police account came wrapped in training and procedure and the benefit of the doubt. Set against all of that, a bystander's word had almost never been enough to move anything. What changed, this time, was not the word. It was the footage. But this time there was the phone. The 17-year-old who had filmed the whole of it posted her video, and within hours it was everywhere, and the country watched, side by side, two completely different accounts of the same event. On one screen was a press release about a medical incident. On the other was 9.5 minutes of a man saying he could not breathe, while an officer knelt on his neck and a crowd pleaded. Both could not be true. One of them was a recording. The footage did what no statement could undo. The careful fog burned off in a single night. By the next day, the 26th of May, all 4 officers had been fired from the department. The mayor was on television calling the death wrong. The video was on every channel on Earth. Crowds had already begun to gather at the corner of 38th and Chicago, and within days the gathering had spread far beyond it, first across the city, then across the country. A story that, in the department's telling, was meant to end as a quiet paragraph about a medical event, had instead become the opening line of the largest reckoning over policing the country had seen in a generation. Sit for a moment with how thin the margin was. If the girl had turned the other way, if her phone had died, if she had been a few minutes earlier or later. The official version had every advantage. It had the authority of the state, the presumption of good faith, and the long habit of a public that did not look too hard at deaths in custody. It had everything except the one thing it could not survive, which was a complete and continuous recording of what had actually happened, held by a teenager who simply would not lower her arm. Being fired, though, is an employment decision. It is not a verdict, and it is not a cause of death. The department could let 4 officers go in a single day, but the law would still have to answer, slowly and under oath, a far harder question. What, precisely, had killed George Floyd? And here the case took its strangest turn, because the doctors who examined his body would end up handing both sides exactly what they wanted. 2 autopsies were performed. Both reached the same one-word conclusion, and that single shared word was about to become the most fought-over piece of evidence in the entire trial. Chapter 6. 2 autopsies, 1 word. The video showed the country what had happened. It could not, by itself, answer the question a courtroom would eventually have to answer, which was why, in the precise and clinical language of medicine, George Floyd had died. That question went to the doctors, and the strange, important fact at the centre of this case is that the doctors agreed on the single most important word, and then disagreed about almost everything around it. The official autopsy was performed by the Chief Medical Examiner for Hennepin County, Dr. Andrew Baker. His ruling on the manner of death was 1 word: homicide, death at the hands of another. He described the cause in careful technical language as a cardiopulmonary arrest, the stopping of the heart and lungs, that occurred while law enforcement was subduing, restraining, and compressing the neck of the deceased. In plain English, his heart and breathing stopped while he was being held down and his neck was being compressed by police. But Baker's report also listed what he called other significant conditions. George Floyd had heart disease, his arteries were narrowed, he had an enlarged heart and high blood pressure, and his blood contained fentanyl, a powerful opioid, along with signs of recent methamphetamine use. Baker did not use the word asphyxia in his report, and it was those 2 facts, the heart and the drugs, sitting in the official document alongside the word homicide, that the defense would later try to pry loose and build an entire alternative story upon. The family did not wait for that story to be told. They commissioned a second independent autopsy, performed by 2 well-known pathologists. Their finding also used the word homicide, but they worded the cause differently. They said George Floyd had died of asphyxia, of sustained pressure that cut off the blood and air his body needed, and they found nothing underlying that had meaningfully contributed. One report emphasized the restraint and listed the heart and the drugs alongside it. The other said the restraint was the whole of it. 2 documents, the same 1-word verdict, 2 different emphases. I have set those 2 reports beside each other more than once, and what strikes me is how little daylight there actually is between them on the thing that matters. Both said homicide, both placed the death inside the restraint. The genuine scientific disagreement was narrower than the public fight made it sound. It was a disagreement about wording and weighting, not about whether police pressure killed him. But a courtroom is not a seminar, and the clever defense does not need a real contradiction. It only needs a crack of doubt, and the official report, with its mention of a bad heart and a dangerous drug, looked to the defense like a crack worth widening into a canyon. So the defense built its theory. George Floyd, they would argue, did not die because a man knelt on him for 9.5 minutes. He died of a heart attack, a fatal rhythm in a damaged heart, brought on by the stress and the adrenaline of the arrest, and pushed over the edge by the fentanyl and the methamphetamine in his system. The level of fentanyl in his blood, they noted, was high enough that, found in a person who had simply died alone at home, a coroner might have called it an overdose. The defence even floated, briefly, the idea that exhaust from the squad car might have poisoned him with carbon monoxide. The argument, stripped to its frame, was this: he was a sick man on drugs. He would have died anyway. The knee was incidental. There were real numbers underneath that argument, and they belong in plain view, so that no one can claim they were hidden. His blood held roughly 11 nanograms of fentanyl per milliliter, along with signs of recent methamphetamine use. Those are not trivial figures. The medical examiner himself, in his private working notes, acknowledged as much. He wrote that if George Floyd had been found dead at home with no other explanation, a level like that could fairly be called an overdose. But he also wrote in the same breath the sentence that the defence could never get past. He was not saying that the drugs had killed him. The honest difficulty of the case lived right there, in a competent and cautious doctor noting a dangerous drug level and refusing, all the same, to call it the cause. Context, he was saying, not cause. The prosecution's answer to all of this arrived in the person of a quiet, precise lung doctor named Martin Tobin, and his testimony is widely remembered as the moment the defence theory died in the room. Tobin did not raise his voice. He walked the jury, breath by breath, through the mechanics of what a healthy body does when it is pinned face down with weight on its back and its neck, and he showed them, on the video, the exact instant he believed the air stopped reaching George Floyd's brain. He told the jury, flatly, that a healthy person subjected to what George Floyd was subjected to would have died. He addressed the fentanyl directly and explained why the breathing pattern on the video was not the breathing of an opioid overdose, because a person dying of an opioid overdose slows down and grows still, while the video showed a man labouring, straining, fighting for air. He dismantled the carbon monoxide idea with a single physiological fact about the oxygen still saturating Floyd's blood. And then there was Dr. Baker himself, the man whose official report the defence was leaning on. Called to the stand, the medical examiner did not retreat. He told the court, in essence, that the heart disease and the fentanyl were context, not cause. They did not put George Floyd on the ground. They did not press on his neck. The thing that killed him, in his professional judgment, was the law enforcement subdual and restraint. The very document the defence had hoped to hide behind belonged, in the end, to the prosecution. That is the heart of this case, and it has to be put exactly, because the confusion around it was deliberately manufactured. 2 autopsies said homicide. The official one named the restraint as the cause, and listed the man's frailties as conditions that did not save him. Every serious medical voice that examined the evidence placed the death inside those 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The drugs and the heart were real. They were simply not why he died. All of this was about to be fought out in front of a jury and a watching world. Subscribe before we go on. Chapter 7. The World Stops. Before we follow Derek Chauvin into a courtroom, we have to account for what happened in the months between the coroner and the trial, because the country George Floyd died in was not the same country by the time the jury was seated. It started with the gatherings at 38th and Chicago, the people drawn to the place itself, and it did not stay there. Within days, the protests had spread to every major American city, and within a couple of weeks they had spread around the world. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. By several independent estimates, somewhere between 15 and 26 million people took part in demonstrations across the United States, in well over 500 separate places, in towns that had never had a protest about anything. By those measures, it was very likely the largest protest movement in the history of the country. There were marches in London and Berlin and Sydney and Rio. A street corner in South Minneapolis had become a word that people chanted in languages George Floyd never spoke. The great majority of those demonstrations were peaceful, ordinary people standing in ordinary streets. But the early days were not calm everywhere, and an honest account says so. In Minneapolis itself, in the first nights, there was unrest and there was fire. A police precinct, the one whose officers had killed him, was abandoned by the department and burned. Businesses were damaged. The city that had produced the death now produced the rawest version of the reaction to it. What followed across the rest of the country and the rest of the summer was, overwhelmingly, the quieter and more durable kind of protest, the kind measured in millions of feet on pavement rather than in broken glass. The reach of it went past the streets. Corporations that had never said a word about policing issued statements. Monuments to other men in other centuries came down. Phrases and demands that had lived for years only at the edges of the national conversation were suddenly in the centre of it, debated on every channel and at every dinner table. Whatever one thought of any particular piece of it, the scale was not in question. A single recording from a single phone had moved the whole country to its feet. The corner itself changed, and it changed permanently. The intersection of 38th and Chicago was closed to traffic and became a memorial, a sprawl of flowers and painted messages and offerings, watched over by the community, eventually given the name George Floyd Square. The grocery store on the corner, the one with the lights on that ordinary evening, became the most visited address in the city. For more than a year, the intersection stayed barricaded against ordinary traffic, the neighborhood unwilling to let it simply become a street again, and the city unsure how to ask. We will return to that corner at the very end of this story, because what it became is the whole point. But it is worth marking here that the transformation began within hours and never fully reversed. And then, in the middle of all of it, came a number that landed like a verdict before the verdict. In March of 2021, as the lawyers were still picking a jury, the city of Minneapolis announced that it had agreed to pay the Floyd family $27 million to settle their civil claim. It was, at the time, the largest pre-trial settlement of its kind in American history, larger than the city had ever paid for any wrongful death. The timing was extraordinary. The city was effectively conceding, in dollars, the enormity of what had happened on its streets, even as the criminal question of who was responsible remained formally open. $500,000 of those dollars was set aside for the neighborhood around the corner itself. The strangeness of that sequence is easy to miss. A civil settlement and a criminal trial answer two different questions. The settlement answered whether the city owed the family something for what its officers had done, and the city said yes, in an amount that dwarfed every payment it had ever made. The criminal trial would answer whether a particular man would lose his freedom for it, and that answer was not yet in. So for a few weeks the country lived in a peculiar limbo, a city having paid one of the largest wrongful death sums in its history for a killing that no court had yet formally assigned to anyone. Money had moved faster than justice, the way it often does, because money is easier to move. There is a temptation, looking back, to treat the protests and the settlement as the resolution, as if the marching and the money were the country squaring its accounts. They were not. They were the pressure, not the verdict. The marches could fill every street in America, and the city could write the largest check in its history, and none of it could convict a single person of a single crime. That still had to happen the slow way, in a single room, in front of 12 people, under rules of evidence that do not care how many million are marching outside. So the story now narrows, from the whole world back down to one courtroom in downtown Minneapolis, and one defendant. Chapter 8. The State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. The trial of Derek Chauvin opened in March of 2021 in the Hennepin County Government Center in downtown Minneapolis, with Judge Peter Cahill presiding. It was the first criminal trial in the history of the state of Minnesota to be broadcast fully and live, and the decision to allow the cameras meant that the country would watch the case argued in real time, the way it had watched the video that started it. Seating a jury at all had been its own ordeal. The case was, by then, the most watched in the country, and finding people who had somehow not formed a fixed opinion took the better part of 3 weeks. Lawyers questioned candidate after candidate about what they had seen, what they believed, whether they could set it aside. The final group of jurors, kept anonymous for their own protection, carried the weight of a verdict the whole world was waiting on. The prosecution had, in an unusual move, been taken over by the state's Attorney General, Keith Ellison, who assembled a team of seasoned trial lawyers to carry it. They faced a single defense attorney, funded by the police union, with the unenviable job of selling the jury on the theory you have already heard, that the heart and the drugs, not the knee, had done the killing. The prosecution called witness after witness, around 36 of them over the better part of 2 weeks. They called the teenage cashier who had taken the bill and who said, on the stand, that he felt a guilt he could not shake. They called the off-duty firefighter who had begged to give aid and been refused, and who wept as she described being kept back. They called the bystander who had pleaded from the sidewalk and who had, in the moment, called the police on the police. They played the video again and again, from every angle that existed, until the jury had seen the 9 minutes and 29 seconds more times than any person should have to. They called the lung doctor, whose quiet testimony took the defense theory apart, breath by breath. And in a moment almost without precedent in an American courtroom, they called the chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, who took the stand and testified against one of his own officers, telling the jury plainly that what Chauvin had done was not training, was not policy, was not policing, but a violation of everything the department was supposed to stand for. When a police chief crosses that line to testify against his own, something in the old machinery has broken. Derek Chauvin did not testify. He invoked his constitutional right to silence and never took the stand in his own defense. The jury would decide his case without hearing a single word from him about what he had done or why. The defense, for its part, called far fewer witnesses than the state and leaned hardest on a forensic pathologist who told the jury that, in his opinion, the cause of death should be classed as undetermined, raising the heart and the drugs and even briefly the carbon monoxide idea. It was a respectable expert making the most of a difficult brief, but set against the lung doctor and the medical examiner and the unbroken video, it did not hold. He faced 3 charges, and it is important to keep them distinct because the law treats them as different things. The most serious was second-degree murder, unintentional, the kind that occurs when a death results from another serious felony, here an assault, without the killer necessarily intending the death. There was third-degree murder, causing a death through a dangerous act committed with a depraved disregard for human life. And there was second-degree manslaughter, causing a death through culpable negligence. The prosecution did not have to prove that Chauvin woke up that morning meaning to kill anyone. It had to prove that he had killed, through assault and through reckless and negligent disregard, a man who posed no threat. In his closing, one of the prosecutors gave the jury a way to hold the whole thing in their heads. He broke the restraint into its parts, the long stretch in which Floyd cried out for help, the briefer stretch in which his body convulsed, the final stretch in which he lay unresponsive and the knee stayed where it was. He told the jury that the reason George Floyd was dead was not a weak heart in the medical sense, but a failure of a different kind in the man who would not get up. That the problem was a heart too small rather than too sick. And he told them that beyond the 36 witnesses they had heard, there was one more witness they could rely on, which was their own common sense, and the thing they had all watched with their own eyes. The jury was out for about 10 hours. On the 20th of April 2021, they returned, and the country stopped to watch. By one estimate, more than 23 million Americans were watching live as the verdicts were read. Guilty on the first count. Guilty on the second. Guilty on the third. All 3. Derek Chauvin's bail was revoked, his hands were cuffed behind him, and he was led out of the courtroom, and for the first time in this long story, a thing that almost never happens in cases like this one had happened. An officer had been held to account, in full, by a jury, on the strength of a recording a teenager had refused to stop making. The verdict was not the end. The sentence, the other officers, and a long climb of appeals were all still to come. Subscribe to see it through. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. A conviction is a finding. A sentence is a number, and on the 25th of June 2021, Judge Cahill delivered it. Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. The sentencing hearing itself was its own kind of reckoning. The court heard from George Floyd's family, including from his young daughter, whose recorded words about missing her father were played in a room full of lawyers and cameras. Chauvin, who had stayed silent through the entire trial, spoke only briefly, offering the family his condolences and saying that legal matters still pending kept him from saying more. It was not an apology, and the family did not receive it as one. The number was not arbitrary, and the reasoning behind it matters. Under Minnesota's guidelines, a man like Chauvin, with no prior record, would ordinarily have faced something closer to 12.5 years. The judge went well beyond that, and he explained why in a written order. He had identified several aggravating factors in the case, but he rested the added years on 2 of them above all. Chauvin had abused a position of trust and authority, and he had treated George Floyd with particular cruelty. The judge was careful to say that the sentence was not a response to public opinion or to the marching in the streets, but to those specific facts. The cruelty and the abuse of trust were the reasons, he said, not the crowds. But the state case was only one of 2. The federal government brought its own charges against all 4 officers for violating George Floyd's civil rights, the rights every person holds against the very government that was restraining him. Faced with that second prosecution, Chauvin chose not to fight it. In December of 2021, he pleaded guilty in federal court. As part of that plea, he also admitted to a separate civil rights violation involving a teenager he had restrained years earlier, a prior episode that had never been answered for. He was sentenced in the federal case to 21 years, to be served at the same time as his state sentence, so that the longer of the 2, the state term, governs how long he stays. And the other 3? Here, above all, the story demands precision, because it would be easy and wrong to sweep all 4 men into a single fate. They were not convicted of murder. Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kung, and Tu Thao were each convicted, at the federal level, of failing in their duty, of depriving George Floyd of his rights by failing to give him medical care, and in the cases of 2 of them, by failing to intervene to stop the man kneeling on him. That federal trial, held about a year and a half after the death, turned on a quieter and harder question than Chauvin's. Not did you kneel, but did you have a duty to stop the man who did, and did you fail it? The jury found that they had. At the state level, Lane pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting manslaughter, and so did Kung. Tao took his chances on a trial decided by the judge on an agreed set of facts, and was found guilty of the same. Their sentences ran in years, not decades, ranging from around 2.5 to around 3.5. Lane, the rookie who had twice asked aloud whether they should turn Floyd onto his side, received the lightest of them. The law, in the end, drew the distinctions the channel title cannot. 1 man knelt. 3 men failed to stop him. Those are not the same crime, and the sentences say so. Because those terms were short, the clock on them ran out quickly. All 3 have now served their sentences and been released, returned to private life and to a period of supervision, while the man who knelt remains behind bars for years to come. That, too, is what the distinctions in the law come to in the end. The difference between kneeling and failing to stop it is measured, on the calendar, in the difference between a few years and most of a lifetime. Chauvin, for his part, did not accept the verdict quietly. He appealed his state conviction, arguing, among other things, that the storm of publicity had made a fair trial impossible, and that the case should have been moved out of the city. The argument had a certain surface logic. How could any juror in Minneapolis not have seen the video, not have an opinion, not feel the pressure of a watching world? But the courts answered that the question is not whether jurors have heard of a case, which in the modern world they almost always have, but whether they can set aside what they have heard and decide on the evidence in the room. In the spring of 2023, the Minnesota Court of Appeals rejected his arguments and upheld the conviction in full, finding that he had received a fair trial before an impartial jury. The Minnesota Supreme Court declined to take the case up, and in November of 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States refused to hear it, letting the conviction stand. The slow machinery of the law had carried his case as high as it could go, and at every level, the answer had been the same. He appealed his state conviction, arguing, among other things, that the storm of publicity had made a fair trial impossible, and that the case should have been moved out of the city. The argument had a certain surface logic. How could any juror in Minneapolis not have seen the video, not have an opinion, not feel the pressure of a watching world? But the courts answered that the question is not whether jurors have heard of a case, which in the modern world they almost always have, but whether they can set aside what they have heard and decide on the evidence in the room. In the spring of 2023, the Minnesota Court of Appeals rejected his arguments and upheld the conviction in full, finding that he had received a fair trial before an impartial jury. The Minnesota Supreme Court declined to take the case up, and in November of 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States refused to hear it, letting the conviction stand. The slow machinery of the law had carried his case as high as it could go, and at every level the answer had been the same. Chapter 10. The Corner After Return. Now to the corner. 38th Street and Chicago Avenue. The grocery store. The curb where the squad car waited on a holiday evening. The same coordinates we began with, the place that meant nothing to anyone outside the neighborhood. It is not nothing anymore. It is George Floyd Square, a named place on the map of the world, marked and tended and visited. The pavement where a man said he could not breathe, transformed into the most recognized street corner in the country. Nothing about the asphalt changed. Everything about what we know happened there did. The 4 men who came to that corner are scattered now across the prison system. Derek Chauvin is held in a federal prison in Texas. He did not get there quietly. In November of 2023, while he was still being held in Arizona, only days after the Supreme Court declined his final appeal, he was attacked by another inmate and stabbed more than 20 times. He survived and was later moved to the prison where he sits today. There is a grim symmetry in it that I do not entirely know what to do with. The man who would not lift his weight off a dying person, himself nearly killed in custody, and living. The other 3, the rookies and the veteran who did not kneel and did not stop it, have already walked free. The effect of those 9 minutes and 29 seconds ran far past the 4 of them. A sweeping federal policing bill was written in George Floyd's name. It passed the House of Representatives and then died in the Senate, and the gap between those 2 facts is its own quiet commentary on how much and how little changed. Cities and states banned or restricted the kind of neck restraint that had killed him. Minneapolis entered into binding agreements to overhaul how it polices. Some of it was real and lasting. Some of it faded as the marching did. Both of those things are true at once, and an honest telling does not pretend otherwise. It is hard to say cleanly what the verdict changed, because the temptation to call it a turning point is strong and only half right. For the family, and for a great many people watching, the conviction mattered enormously on its own terms. A police officer had knelt on an unarmed man in custody, in front of cameras, and had been convicted of murder and sent to prison for it. That outcome is rare enough in American history that the rarity is itself the point. For once the system had not closed ranks. For once the recording had been enough. And yet one conviction is not a cure. The thing that set this case apart was never that the killing was uniquely brutal. Deaths in custody were not new, and neither was the careful paragraph written afterward to bury them. The only thing that was truly different was that this one had been captured in full and could not be talked away. That is a thin thread to hang a national reckoning on. It means the gap between an accounting and a forgotten name can come down to whether a stranger happened to be standing in the right place, with a charged phone and the nerve to keep it raised. The corner had its own slow afterlife. For more than a year the square stayed barricaded, a place of pilgrimage and grief that the neighbourhood guarded and the city did not know how to reclaim. Eventually the streets reopened, uneasily, to traffic, and the argument over what the place should permanently become, a memorial, a garden, an ordinary intersection again, went on for years, and in some ways goes on still. The story was written down too, in journalism that won the highest prizes, and in books that tried to set the whole of his life beside the whole of his death, so that the man would not be remembered only as the last 9.5 minutes of his life. And the teenager, the 17-year-old girl who raised her phone and would not lower it, who did the one thing that made every other thing in this story possible, was awarded a Pulitzer Prize, a special citation for a recording that changed the course of a country. She wrote nothing. She testified that she had spent nights wondering whether she could have done more, when in truth she had done the only thing that worked. Without her arm held steady for 9.5 minutes, the official paragraph about a medical incident would very likely have been the last word, and you would never have heard the name George Floyd. I keep coming back, in the end, to how ordinary all of it was. An ordinary corner, a small fake bill, a frightened man, a pack of cigarettes. None of the pieces were large. What made it enormous was not the size of any single thing, but that for once the whole of it was recorded, start to finish, and could not be talked away. That is the uncomfortable lesson sitting underneath this case. It is not that what happened to George Floyd was unique. It is that the proof was, and that the proof existed only because one person decided to keep watching when looking away would have been easier. How many corners are there in how many cities where no one happened to be filming? A little girl named Gianna, George Floyd's daughter, was filmed not long after her father died, lifted up on someone's shoulders, saying that her daddy had changed the world. She was too young to know how right she was or what it had cost. The corner is the same corner. We are the ones who are different now, and we do not get to be allowed to forget what happened there. If you want more stories told this carefully, subscribe and stay with the channel. It is free and it keeps work like this alive.